Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, accompanied by the Dean of Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, Albert Carnesale.
Welcome. It's a privilege to have with us today a distinguished alumnus of Harvard College and longtime friend of the Kennedy School, the Vice President of the United States, Al Gore. Our guest today truly needs no introduction. This audience is familiar with his background and accomplishments. Indeed, he's spoken in this forum before, but I would like to note a few important items. Al Gore's high school classmates described him in the senior yearbook as, and I quote, frighteningly good at many things, close quote. He maintained that reputation as a Harvard undergraduate. He was a leader in student government, was a member of the Young Democrats Club, played basketball, and graduated with honors. Even as a student of government, he contributed to the academic literature. He wrote an article for the inaugural issue of the Harvard Political Review, a publication sponsored by our Institute of Politics. His senior thesis, entitled The Impact of Television on the Conduct of the Presidency, 1947-1969, was supervised by our own Professor Richard Neustadt and was way ahead of its time. Just 10 years after graduation, when the House of Representatives opens its debates to television coverage, Congressman Al Gore was the first member to speak before the cameras. More recently, many of us from the Harvard community gathered before the large television screen here and watched him masterfully advocate the passage of NAFTA. As a congressman and senator from Tennessee, and now as vice president, Al Gore is admired for his ability to gather, absorb, understand, and synthesize vast amounts of complex information. Whether the issue is defense policy or arms control or trade policy or space technology or the environment or the information superhighway, he's always been among the most informed and most influential of leaders. As vice president, he's been the architect of the comprehensive National Performance Review and is responsible for the Clinton administration's ongoing effort to reinvent government. Through this effort, he aims to improve the quality of services provided by government while eliminating unnecessary spending. Reinventing government is what the Kennedy School is all about. We pursue this mission through research on public problems, through teaching current and future generations of leaders, and through outreach programs designed to identify, recognize, and replicate innovative programs in public policy. We not only support the President's and the Vice President's initiative to reinvent government, we admire and applaud it, and we admire and applaud them. As Vice President, our Speaker has raised the importance and stature of that office to levels which our nation has not seen for quite some time, if ever. We're honored to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming the Vice President of the United States, Al Gore.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Al Carnesale, for your very generous and warm introduction. I'm very grateful to you and to the school for the opportunity to speak here. President and Mrs. Rudenstein, thank you so much for your courtesy in being here and for your friendship and for your outstanding leadership of this institution, Harvard. And to Mayor Tom Menino, thank you for meeting me at the airport, and congratulations, and look forward to working with you. We've worked together for quite some time. In fact, he played an important role last year for us, and we really appreciate all that you do. To Charles Royer, the director of the Institute of Politics, and to the distinguished members of the faculty who are present. Al already mentioned Dick Neustadt, who was so important to me here, and his wife Shirley Williams is here also. I believe Doris Kearns Goodwin is here with Dick Goodwin. She was the entry master in Dunster House, and Marty and Ann Peretz, and I could talk about a number of others here. One of the last times I was here, Marvin Kalb interviewed me in this format, and Professor John Kenneth Galbraith has been a longtime friend of my family, and I'm honored to call him a friend and a teacher. Mike McElroy, with whom I've worked so long and hard on the global environmental issues, and Dean Jeremy Knowles, and Ron Thiemann, who's been an important advocate on the environment within the realm of values, and certainly I could go around this auditorium and mention many others, but let me just say to all of you what a pleasure it is to be here. Actually, as I look out, I see one person visiting who is an extremely important ally and a member of our coalition in the Congress, Congresswoman Jane Harman from Los Angeles, and certainly glad you're here, Jane. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back at Harvard, where I studied government in a formal way, as opposed to the way it actually works. And I was a student here at a tumultuous time. George Will said recently that you could say about politicians what many said about students in the 1960s. It's not fair to judge all of them by the behavior of most of them. That's no surprise, of course. A lot of politicians now were students in the 1960s. And for a lot of us, we were not disappointed by the experience. Of course, there have always been many people who have held a dour view of college campuses, even this illustrious campus. I remember reading that once W.E.B. Du Bois was congratulated for conquering centuries of discrimination to become the first African American granted a Ph.D. from Harvard. He replied, "Believe me, the honor was entirely Harvard's." Today, though, the honor really is entirely mine, because I'm honored to be speaking to students at one of the great schools of public policy in the entire world. I'd like to say I'm also equally honored by the presence of young men and women from Youth Build, who are learning trade and skills as they rebuild housing in the inner city. And I'm honored as well that we have with us today residents of Upham's Corner, what the urban planners call a distressed inner city community. If we are going to turn our country toward a new future, we must all learn from them and from millions like them in both rural and urban communities. I'll have more to say about Upham's Corner later, but let me start by describing for you the situation that they faced not so long ago. It was one of devastation. Not only were buildings abandoned, they were being torched. One community organizer remembers, "I could smell it every night on the way home, the old timbers burning." In the 80s, the drug trade took over the streets of Upham's Corner. Crime became rampant. Local businesses closed. The proud old Strand Theater was boarded up. Families struggling to stay together had few places to turn. This, of course, isn't unique. The problems faced by people in Upham's Corner are faced by communities in many, many cities all over this country. For example, at Malcolm X Elementary School, a few miles from the gleaming white marble of the Capitol Dome in Washington. No white marble here. Thieves have carried off whatever of the jungle gym is not bolted to the ground. The fence is mangled where a sixth grader crashed a car he had hot-wired. One article recently quoted a security guard there talking about his work at a nearby junior high. When students from the school were killed, it was this man's duty to walk the mother or father to the student's locker to help them clean out the books, papers, and gym shoes. How many had died, he was asked. 20, maybe 30, he said, the tears welling up in his eyes. This is life in inner city America. An exaggeration? No, it's really not. People who think that violent crime has been going up in America are dead right. The annual rate per 1,000 went up from 597 in 1980 to 758 last year. And while this is true all over America, and indeed rates for smaller cities are going up even more rapidly than for the very biggest, it's also true that crime is epidemic in black communities. In Washington, 42% of young black men are in jail, on bail, on parole, probation, or wanted for an arrest. As agonizing as it is to live in a neighborhood of drive-by shootings and gang wars, crime is only one symptom of what's wrong. Discrimination, alienation, drugs, family violence, despair, and lack of skills all contribute to a crisis of the spirit within the poverty-stricken communities of the inner city. What has caused the epidemic? Well, certainly when we analyze the differences between white and black opportunity, racism is at the root of it. But that's not the whole answer. While we have moved to erase legal barriers to equality, we have seen a dramatic increase of violence in black urban communities, particularly since the scourge of crack cocaine was introduced in the 1980s. In far too many communities, the culture of violence associated with the drug trade has become part of the social fabric and the means by which non-drug-related disputes are settled. Meanwhile, along with the surge in violence, family life has disintegrated. In 1960, 20% of all black children were living in fatherless families. Now it is 68%. Recently, President Clinton quoted William Julius Wilson in his moving speech in Memphis about inner-city violence. Both the President and I find Dr. Wilson's argument persuasive. He argues that joblessness has increased among young black men, partly because jobs have vanished from urban America. He argues that the two-parent black family is disappearing because male joblessness has made marriage less attractive. But for those who feel this is only a black phenomenon, I say this: look again. Charles Murray, of all people, made this point last month in a Wall Street Journal article. In the 1960s, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote his notorious memo about the disintegration of the black family, at the time he wrote that memo, the black illegitimacy rate was 26%. What is the white rate now? 22%. And what is it for white women below the poverty line? 44%. The breakdown of the poor family is not just a black phenomenon. In Murray's words, the ethnic group with the most people in poverty, the most illegitimate children, the most women on welfare, the most unemployed men, and the most arrests for serious crimes are European American whites. But I'm not here today to talk just about the problem or about the theories concerning its origin. My profession is politics, the only profession, Robert Louis Stevenson once wrote, for which no preparation is thought necessary. And while discussing the problems is not irrelevant for a politician, and certainly analyzing the root causes is essential, for without it, creating solutions is like building a skyscraper without a foundation. At some point, politicians have to grapple with solutions. That's what we've been trying to do, and that's what I would like to do today. Because the solutions this administration has in mind are different from those that have been proposed before in some crucial ways. They originate in a large shift in the way our culture has decided to relate to the world, a philosophical shift away from a vision of single cause, single effect, and toward one admitting complexity and focusing on context. This change has begun to be reflected in public policy, as we have started to abandon the notion that we can look at a single problem in isolation from all others. We have moved toward the idea that problems come in clusters and can only be solved when we treat the underlying dynamic of how they relate to each other. Our new emphasis on the environment, for example, about which I've spoken here many times, is in one sense part of this new appreciation for context. How does it relate to the delivery of social services? Well, we used to look at a pregnant teenager and ask, how can we teach her not to have babies? We thought we could solve that with a single silver bullet, say sex education in the schools. Now, we believe that in order to help her, we have to be aware of the needs of her whole family and the needs of the community around her. The best social worker now looks at everything going on in her life, looks at her relationship with each member of her family, looks at what's happening in school and among her friends. Do we map out the same approach for her that we would for everybody? No. We map out one that is as closely tailor-made to her and her circumstances as possible. We are seeing the beginnings of the same shift that we have seen in family policy in our policies toward communities. In the past, we have treated each symptom of decay in our most disadvantaged communities as if it existed in a vacuum. It is time to assert that they do not. Time to understand that communities need to be looked at in their entirety. It is time to adjust our strategies accordingly. Thus, a community without jobs is likely to be a community without husbands and without active, engaged fathers. And a community without intact families is likely to be a community with high rates of juvenile crime and violence. And an unsafe community is not likely to be very successful at attracting new businesses and new jobs. Such communities are suffering from a vicious tautology, failure that feeds upon failure. The result? Communities where drug dealers become role models and where kids plan their own funerals. Government as we know it is poorly equipped to deal with these communities. Why? Partly because government as we know it is itself divided into programs that treat only symptoms. Social workers cluster in one department trying to treat the symptoms of poverty and family disintegration. Economic development specialists cluster in other departments trying to come up with strategies to convince the market it should invest in these communities. Criminal justice workers, police, parole officers, and prosecutors cluster in yet another department in an attempt to address crime. The net effect often seems to be a Band-Aid here and a Band-Aid there. Small consolation amidst all the pain. President Clinton has a different approach. an approach that takes account of the limits of government and our resources. For government cannot do everything, and a government hamstrung by deficits cannot hope to erase poverty overnight. Yet it is an approach that can make the crucial difference. And it's an approach which has influenced our entire program since January 21st. To begin with, the President devised an economic plan to put our national economy in shape to compete in the new global economy. We cannot create jobs for Americans anywhere unless we compete successfully in the global economy. That has been the meaning of our deficit reduction plan, so controversial at the time it was passed. A plan designed to lower interest rates and make available more investment capital. It has also been the meaning of our attempt to shift federal spending from consumption to investment, our attempt to remove regulatory impediments to business formation, our attempt to increase competitiveness by opening foreign markets to goods made in America, and our attempt to rebuild roads and bridges and to create the finest information infrastructure in the world. But it's not enough to invest in the infrastructure of America. We have to invest in the human infrastructure of America, our workforce. And so, second, the President has called on the country to invest in people. That's the meaning of all the increased support for WIC, immunization, family preservation, and Head Start. And that's why the President was so adamant about expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit. He wanted to make work pay off, and it's beginning to. That's also why we've supported Goals 2000, historically black colleges, and other education programs. That's also why the President has announced the most ambitious social program of our generation, the wholesale revolution in our healthcare system, because we can't move ahead with a system that leaves almost 40 million Americans uninsured. Creating a new healthcare system is a key component to our investment in America's future. First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, the architect of the President's plan, will be in Boston tomorrow to talk more about that. Another key part of that investment is our effort to literally reinvent government that Al referred to earlier. I often give whole speeches in their entirety on this subject, and I'll refrain from doing so today, but I encourage anyone curious about it to ask questions. In brief, we're going to have to shift from the old top-down, hierarchical, rule-bound approach that comes out of the industrial era toward a decentralized approach that empowers employees with the flexibility and authority and knowledge that they need to make decisions that affect the work they do, eliminate the unnecessary layers of middle management, hold them accountable for results, measure performance, and create a government that works better and costs less by responding to its customers. It's also why the President has created a third component of this plan, a new way of looking at distressed communities, a new way of organizing government's response. One of the recommendations in the National Performance Review was for a community empowerment strategy. I want to talk a little bit about that strategy today. We want to call upon all Americans to come together from the bottom up in a new compact to help poor communities in urban and rural America join in contributing to the growth of regional economies. You know, recently I read about a new technology emerging in the garment industry that is supposed to allow you to go to a local tailor, pick out a fabric, a color, and a design, and then someone takes your measurements with a handheld instrument that resembles what the Federal Express drivers use in their trucks. And they send the data to some machine cutting cloth in another city. And the next morning, you have the suit or the dress or the article of clothing that you have ordered. It's a sophisticated version of buying off the rack, but the result is much better tailored to the contours of your body and to your own preferences. Until this decade, social services have come in only a few sizes. We don't have to do that anymore. we think we have the capacity to empower each community with a tailor-made response, much more appropriated to the unique set of circumstances, problems, and opportunities in each individual community. Many of you are already familiar with the two opportunities to bring us together in this effort. National Service will offer thousands of young Americans the chance to learn in exchange for working in their local communities on projects that are designed within the community. Second, community policing will enable local communities to come together all across America to take back their streets, making them safe for people who want to raise a family, teach a child, or start up a business. These programs are tailor-made because for both of them, communities sign up and then design how they want them to operate. But we're offering more, a lot more. Our community empowerment agenda offers an assortment of services that every community in America can choose and then shape to meet their own goals. They can be grouped in 5 basic areas. Number 1, access to capital, credit, and banking services. Reform of the Community Reinvestment Act will reward our major financial institutions for making sound investments in all communities. At the same time, we'll make equity investments matched by private dollars to spur a network of community-based financial institutions to help these communities build the credit, loans, and business opportunities that they need. Number 2, targeted small and minority business assistance. Small Business Administration, one-stop capital shops, minority enterprise and exports, expanded microenterprise loans, and tax incentives for investment will be available to leverage private investments in communities that have been previously ignored all too often. Third, investment partnerships with other financial institutions and with states. Creative partnerships with private foundations, union pension funds, and government-sponsored initiatives. Next, world-class schools. Chapter 1 reauthorization will assure that schools in poor communities have the resources targeted to meet the Goals 2000 so that all students have the opportunity and responsibility to meet and establish new world-class standards. And we believe this is going to pass early next year. It's already passed the House. And then rural development and investment initiatives. These major new investments will assure that rural and Indian country communities can provide the clean water and other infrastructure necessary to build businesses, plants, and jobs. Is this assortment of investment ideas available to all communities in a one-size-fits-all package? No, that's part of what I'm saying here. The federal government has no intention of dictating to local communities how to design, trim, and cut these new investments to fit their unique circumstances. They will do it. But isn't there something more we can make available to the most devastated of our communities? In fact, there is. Congress has passed a $3.5 billion package of targeted tax incentives and investments to support the designation of 9 empowerment zones and 95 enterprise communities. The incentives are designed to stimulate the expansion of jobs within the zones. They will lower the cost of doing business for those that hire zone residents, and they'll provide incentives and capital for business expansion. They'll also upgrade the work skills of zone residents. How do we pick these communities? Well, in January, the President and I will announce the beginning of an application process for designation under the new legislation. In the initial round, communities will have 6 months to apply. And if they meet the criteria, much of it involving the quality of private sector support they've been able to secure, then they'll win. How can communities become designated as EZs or ECs, empowerment zones or enterprise communities? The first thing to understand is that we at the federal level will operate above all as an investor. It won't be government as usual. It's not pork barrel politics. We're devising a set of criteria The winners will be those who come up with a plan meeting the criteria. And while the list of criteria is not yet complete, certainly any plan with a chance to succeed should include ways to deal with safety, with job creation, environmental justice, with co-investing. That is, a plan to attract investment from state, local, and private sector sources. We'll be publishing the criteria soon. We don't pretend that it is a complete listing of everything a community needs to do, but we feel very confident that the list we have makes the most sense. I also believe that each community must examine its own assets, build off strengths, exploit its unique competitive advantage. They may discover some startling new ones. For example, consider how handicapped center cities were in the old industrial economy of the 1950s. The engine of economic growth then was the mass production plant requiring lots of acres for development if you were going to put up a brand new factory. In the new economy, means of production don't require as much land area. There's no reason why the engines of growth in the year 2000, the Silicon Valleys and research triangles of the future, can't be located in Harlem next to Columbia or in South Central Los Angeles next to USC. Those are some possible criteria. You may have others, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts when we move to the Q&A. But here's another point. We're trying to design this process so that there will be no losers in the application process. Let's say that a community puts together a good plan and then doesn't get designated as one of the 104 sites picked. Hasn't it learned a lot about itself in the process? Hasn't it discovered resources and ideas it can use even without the federal money? We're designing the criteria and the application process in order to magnify the prospects of that outcome. In a way, the plan's a little bit like the old story about Dumbo's magic feather. You remember the elephant who thought he could fly because he was carrying the magic feather in his trunk. Then one day he dropped the feather and discovered he could fly anyway. The secret wasn't the feather, but his big ears. Well, communities may lose the magic feather of a Community Empowerment Award and discover resources within themselves they never knew they had. That line takes on new political valence these days. I didn't mean it that way. There are those who say that the $3.5 billion in this program is just a pittance. What you need to know is how much more we are willing to invest and how much more we expect local regions to invest in communities that develop workable plans. Our network of new SBA one-stop centers will generate at least $3 billion in private investments. Our reform of the Community Reinvestment Act, rewarding thrifts and regulated banks for investment and lending in these communities, will generate many times this amount in loans and investments. Our cooperative partnerships between HUD and the great government-sponsored housing enterprises like Fannie Mae will make many billions of new private dollars available for home ownership, rehabilitation, and community development. And we will create cooperative arrangements within each of the federal agencies, a range of resources totaling several billion dollars for local communities to decide whether they're needed and how to use them. And that's just the beginning. You know, one of the lessons of the 60s is that governments alone, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot turn around the vicious cycle of poverty with handouts. As the President often remarks, governments don't raise kids, families do. In the same way, governments don't build most jobs or businesses or communities. People do, people working together. But government can listen, and government can be flexible in its response. And government can respond to each local community's own plan. For too long, government programs have operated like the proverbial stovepipes, with a separate program and mandate for each narrowly perceived problem. A reinvented government will do it differently. A reinvented government will use what some of us have taken to calling the virtual Department of Cleveland approach. Let me explain. if Cleveland outlines a plan in which we can help. We want to create a team made up of people from all agencies to help get the job done. They won't really constitute a department of Cleveland, but while they're working together, the agency boundaries will disappear, and they can work together as if they were a department until the job's done. We've been spending an enormous amount of time each week for several months now with a task force from several different departments figuring out exactly how to make this approach work. It's the kind of custom tailoring and responsiveness that I hope we can foster with the newly created Community Enterprise Board. This board, which the President asked me to chair when he created it last month by presidential memorandum, is made up of 15 agencies. We're exploring a variety of ways to give distressed communities flexibility and free them from the complicated categorical programs. We want to give them a single, responsive point of access to the federal government. Well, those are some of our ideas, and there's no guarantee of success, but a former president of Harvard, James Conant, used to say, "Behold the turtle. It makes progress only when it sticks its neck out." We're sticking our necks out, and we're doing it for a good cause. What gives me hope about all this are groups like Youth Build. What gives me hope is that there are places where communities have reclaimed their lives, like Upham's Corner. They had enormous obstacles, but they had one great strength: people who wanted to stay and fight. They banded together and they changed. Not the world, but their world. They drove an open drug trade from the area, closed the crack houses, created the Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corporation, created housing and commercial revitalization, created 2 loan companies, one for small businesses and another for individuals, and now they're in the process of reclaiming the former Boston Insulated Wire site to create at least 100 jobs and maybe 300 to 400 more. Why do I find that so exciting? Because it is an example of what we want to stimulate all over this country. Because here was a community in decay: crime, drugs, poor schools, and no jobs. Washington isn't reclaiming their community, they are. And I hope that if Americans see the changes beginning to happen at Upham's Corner, our nation will begin to feel more strongly that change is possible. Well, it's now nearly 30 years since I came to this community to find a different kind of distress. Those were years dominated by America's torment over Vietnam, and George Will to the contrary, the behavior of most was sparked by idealism and concern. But campuses were shut down, and for a time the smell of tear gas hung over the dormitories. In those days, many doubted that change was possible, either in Southeast Asia or in Watts. Today we live in a hopeful time, and for those who say that the kind of approach I've outlined here is beyond the capacity of government or our country, for those who look at distressed communities and give up hope that they can really change, I ask, a decade ago, who would have thought that the Berlin Wall would have fallen, that Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk would sit down as co-recipients of the Nobel Prize, that Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat would shake hands on the White House lawn. This is the time for the United States, in the aftermath of the Cold War, to turn our attention to those in our country who need help. It does not mean we shirk our responsibilities abroad. It means that we meet our responsibilities abroad and at home. For while the great battles of the decades ahead are likely to be economic, the greatest challenge to our economic strength is not the stiff competition from the Pacific Rim or Europe. The greatest challenge to our economic strength is here at home, where the decaying cores of too many inner cities and the poverty-stricken heartlands of rural America threaten to erode our dynamic regional economies from within. That is what we intend to change. That's what this new approach is all about. I believe we can do it by supporting the efforts of the people of Upham's Corner to help themselves, by supporting the families at Malcolm X School. Change is a process. If at the end of this decade or the next the process is not yet complete, it will be the jobs of the students at this institution to carry it on. Just as we have learned from the mistakes of the past, you can learn from our mistakes. And if part of learning is the knowledge that there's no magic feather, well, part of it is also learning that there really are ways to fly. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We do have some time for questions. Let me say what the way we'll go about this. Notice there's a microphone right here, one there, one up to the left of that pillar, and one to the right of that one. We'd appreciate it if you'd line up there and if people would identify themselves before they ask the question. But first, we're going to go to somebody who's experienced at asking questions of the Vice President for our first question, Professor Richard Neustadt. If you would please ask the first question.
Pardon me just a
You
moment.
have no idea the trepidation I
Yes,
feel. Still with me.
he knows perfectly well that I wouldn't impose on the situation. Mr. Vice President,
Easy for you to say.
as you spoke about communities and community empowerment development and your hope to develop community plans, the best of which could get federal support that would generate also private support. I couldn't help remembering the analogy that was current about the time you were a freshman and sophomore here. It was originally called the Demonstration Cities Program. The Johnson administration hoped to designate 9 cities and see what could be done to make them national symbols of economic revival, as it was then understood, less comprehensive than what you now understand. Before Congress authorized that program, it had made it applicable, as I recall, to 109 cities. The demonstration effect was lost. The focus of investment was lost. The intensity was lost. The product overall was minimal. My question is very simple. How
How did you start, though? You assured me that you
how do you propose
would not impose on the situation. Did I have a better idea of this? Go ahead.
with fewer resources available by far?
Yeah.
How do you propose to induce Congress to allow you to be selected?
Thank you. Excellent question. I often felt that way. Well, let me start by saying 2 things. We fought with the Congress successfully, and I say fought with the Congress, the majority in Congress agreed with us that because of the nation's experience in the 1960s, we should not repeat that mistake. There was a compromise of sorts, which is reflected in the structure of the program as I outlined it. There are only 9 empowerment zones. There are an additional number, 95 enterprise communities. The major focus will be on the 9 for the demonstration effect, but it is being approached quite differently than the program in the 1960s. We are trying to learn not just how to create an example that people can look at and then mimic if they can somehow manage to get the resources that created the example. We are looking at the opportunity to work in these 9 empowerment zones and the 95 enterprise communities as an opportunity to learn how to heal the relationship between the federal government and local communities. The way the federal government presently relates to communities doesn't make a lot of sense. The communities have to jump through all kinds of hoops. The mayor can tell you all about it. He's been very eloquent on this point. And the people in one program are operating often at cross purposes from the people in another program. If by Herculean efforts those problems were somehow avoided in a demonstration community of some sort, then reappear in the relationship between the federal government and every other community, we haven't accomplished very much. But we hope to learn from that relationship. Second point, after passage of the legislation and before the first steps were taken to implement it, we brought in mayors and local members of city councils, neighborhood groups, activist groups at the grassroots level, governors and state legislators and others. Folks from the director of Youth Build, for example, was one of many from around the country who came to talk with us. And we asked them questions in intensive meetings about how we can avoid the mistakes that were made in the 1960s. And we got veterans of that program in the 1960s to come and explain to us where it went wrong and how it went wrong and how we could avoid the same traps. So we believe that we can profit from that experience. Right here, yes.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Caputo. I'm the chair of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute of Politics. On behalf of the undergraduates who are here, I would like to welcome you. My question has to do, quite obviously, with what you stated about community. I arrived here at Harvard as a very idealistic first-year student. And since that time, I've been exposed to a lot of different things, and I feel as though, to a large degree, that sense of community that I feel when I want to leave here, I want to have this sense of community and do something to change the community. And I'm wondering from you what our generation of leaders here at the college can do after we graduate to truly change our communities. It's a very general question, but I'd like your comments.
Well, it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. I urge you, all of you, to get deeply involved in the life of the community in which you live. Some will find that they're pulled towards some form of public service, but even if you're not, there are many ways to give a positive answer to your question. I have seen time and time again how a single man or woman who pays attention to what's going on in the community, reads about the developments and understands them in context, and then begins to advocate the positive change that is necessary, can make a tremendous difference. You will find, if you try, you will be amazed at how little resistance there is to you playing a meaningful role in improving your community. You'll be shocked. You'll find that you're entering a vacuum. You'll find that so many people aren't involved and are just waiting for somebody to devote the energy and passion to the cause that's necessary, that they'll start asking you what to do next. So don't hesitate. Don't be reluctant. Your efforts are greatly needed in the community where you live. Now, are there microphones up also?
Well, just on the second level, there's one there.
Okay, I can't quite see them for the lights. There?
Right.
Okay.
Right here.
Yes, sir. Oh, now I see. Okay, start here and then there. Yeah.
My name is Jan Boyer. I'm here at the Kennedy School. Mr. Vice President, I am concerned about implementation of the ideas contained in the NPR, and I have a two-part question. First, what will you do in the future to ensure implementation continues over the next 10 years?
Mm-hmm.
Second part, your mastery of detail, which Dean Carnesale referred to, will allow you to recall NPR recommendation HHS 10, in
Yes,
which
of
you
course.
advocate charging food and healthcare manufacturers for FDA services. Now my question is, why not eliminate duplication and have the manufacturers test the products themselves under guidelines established by the FDA?
Yeah. First of all, when he refers to the NPR, it's the National Performance Review, which was the document containing all of our recommendations for reinventing government. I said at the time it was released that full implementation of all the recommendations could take as long as 8 to 10 years. I think we're a little ahead of schedule. We've made a lot of progress already. The President has issued a series of executive orders already. 40 of the recommendations that require statutory changes have already been passed by the House of Representatives, and Congresswoman Harman was a leader among the freshmen in helping to get that passed, and the Senate is expected to pass it early next year. A large number of the remaining changes are being included in the 95 budget submission. We have a process in place for tracking every single one of the changes recommended in the report. We're going to stay right with it, and I'm very optimistic about our success. Now, as for the specific recommendation that companies that receive inspections from FDA pay the cost of those inspections, that's what you're asking about?
I was actually asking, your recommendation says to charge them for that, and I'm saying why not have the companies do it themselves under guidelines established by the FDA?
Well, in some cases, we do recommend an approach like that. For example, as a supplement to the regular OSHA inspections, we believe that there are cases where companies that follow prescribed guidelines can take the place of inspections that don't occur anyway because there's such a shortage of inspectors. But there are problems with that approach, and where food safety is concerned, for example, you don't want people who have an incentive to ignore a problem or not to alert the public there is a problem, have the sole responsibility for alerting the public that there is a problem. So I'm not sure I'd want food safety handled that way. In fact, I'm sure I don't. Yes.
Hi, my name is Keith Hennessy. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School, and since the undergraduates have already welcomed you, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of everyone else here.
Thank you.
I have my copy of the NPR here, and I want to congratulate you. It's a fantastic report, and I'd like to salute you and your staff for all of the hard work you've done.
Thank you very much. We'll move on now. No, seriously, thank you. Go ahead.
I would love to see all of these recommendations implemented. I think they're great. I'm worried about two things. One is the savings estimates, which I've heard some people say are quite rosy. And then two is something that Jan hinted at, and that is that a lot of these recommendations really attack some sacred cows. And I went through the list and tried to figure out which groups might be opposed to some of these. And I see the NRA, I see the vineyards, I see veterans, I see farmers, I see mayors and governors. I see a lot of people who are not going to like some of these things in here, and I would like to know, what is your strategy?
Are you sure about that?
I'd like to know, what is your strategy for getting some of these hard ones through? How are you going to do it when they haven't been able to do it before?
I was in Mexico last week, and the phrase there is vacas sagradas, sacred cows, and there are a lot of sacred cows taken on in our report. But the American people are demanding a new approach in government. I don't want to be naive about this. I know how the system works, but I also know that we have reached a point where so many people are fed up with the old way of doing business that when their elected representatives have an opportunity to vote on a package of sweeping changes that offend lots of special interest groups all at the same time, the American people are telling their elected representatives, do it now. And our task really is one of tactics and strategy to get the vote framed in a way that allows the American people to put that kind of pressure on their elected representatives. I'm confident that it can be done. I think you're going to be surprised at the number of these recommendations that really are adopted. Now, let me also respond to your point about the cost estimates. We believe our cost estimates are quite conservative. We believe that the savings will be significantly larger than the ones that we estimated. But there is a difference between savings and scorable deficit reduction under the arcane rules of the budget process. Just to give you one small example, there are hundreds that I could give you, but we recommended closing the government's Uniformed Military Health Services University. It's unnecessary. It's a huge waste of money. You close it, you don't have those expenses anymore. In fact, you save $330 million. The Congressional Budget Office scored that at 0. Why? Well, because under the arcane rules they use, they say, well, we estimate that those savings will be below the budget cap in the category in which that spending occurs, so there's no scorable deficit reduction. It's real money, and the taxpayers are shelling it out every year, and when you cut that out, you save real money. You can go through example after example like that. Procurement reform. We found that in order to buy a personal computer, a government employee may have to get 23 separate written authorizations. When you get one written authorization, you save money. A lot of the people in those management control categories are unnecessary. Their positions are being eliminated, 252,000 such positions. That, according to the arcane scoring rules, comes out at 0. Well, the head of the person that makes those estimates wrote a letter in which he said publicly, these are real savings, they just can't be scored according to these rules. So it's a very misleading way in which the system, as it now operates, scores these things. It's really part of the problem. The system is so messed up, it can't even officially recognize what it means to get well and the steps that are necessary in order to fix it. But thank you for your assessment of it, and incidentally, the people who work with me were also very pleased on Friday when the General Accounting Office completed its massive review of our report, and out of all the recommendations in that whole big book, they found only one that they took issue with. So we were very pleased with that expert review. Yes?
Good afternoon, Mr. Vice President. My name is Avery Gardner. I'm a first-year student at the college. We're all familiar with the famous sign in Clinton's campaign headquarters that said, "It's the economy, stupid." But now the administration seems to be shifting from the simplistic view of America's problems to one which appreciates the more complex relationships between issues. Could you tell us what prompted that shift in attitude?
It's not a shift in attitude. We have always, we believed then as we believe now, that in order to improve the economy, we have to pay attention to human capital as well as infrastructure and access to financing. We believe that, as I said in this speech, that you cannot restore the economy of a distressed community unless you look at welfare reform, unless you look at health care, unless you look at the number of families that don't have fathers, unless you look at the absence of jobs, the crime rate, the use of drugs, and the rest. These problems are all interconnected. And so the campaign slogan was a useful focus, and it's still our focus. But the complexity we perceive in the proper way to solve the problem is not new. We've learned more about it as we've taken office and wrestled with it, but this is not a new view. Both President Clinton and I talked about it during the campaign. In our campaign book, we outlined some of the ideas we wanted to initiate. This is the first formal presentation of this new community empowerment strategy. but the roots of it can be found in the campaign. Yes.
So, Vice President, my name is Nader Barzin. I'm a special student here at Harvard from the Institute of Political Studies of Paris. My question concerns nuclear energy and the disposition of nuclear waste. I'd like to know what is your view on the evolution of various nuclear industries and programs in the world, and in particular, what is your stand on the disposition of the highly enriched uranium and plutonium that will be dismantled from nuclear weapons during the arms reduction program?
Well, this is both a national and an international problem, as your question indicates. And on Saturday, I'll be traveling to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and then Russia for several days. And one of the topics that I'll be working on with Prime Minister Chernomyrdin there is the issue of highly enriched uranium and also the problem associated with reactors of the Chernobyl class. There are a great many of them still operating, and the Russians have asked for our help in really assessing the answer to your question, both in our country and in their country, and we're busy about that task. I think that the current generation of reactors presents enormous problems. I don't exclude the possibility that a new generation of passively safe reactors might be far more attractive in the future. But the problem of nuclear waste has not yet been solved. We have to continue looking for the right answer. We are at work on that right now. I won't pretend to you that we have all the answers, but we're hard at work on it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Vice President. My name is Trip Dubard. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School, and I'm especially interested in information technology and the idea of this information superhighway. What I've been wondering about lately is the idea of whether this may create a new class of information haves and information have-nots, especially in light of your comments today on the creation of communities, especially in poor, underprivileged communities.
Right.
What role do you foresee government in having in ensuring that those who may not naturally or normally have access to the higher technology necessary will be able to have access to this information superhighway?
In one of the many sessions on community empowerment that we had in leading up to the announcement of this process, and a process of which this speech today is part, we looked at this particular question. How can a community work with its telephone company, its cable company, its cellular company, its other information industries and utilities to address the problem of inadequate access to information services within distressed communities? We believe that that's a fundamental part of changing the pattern within a community from a dysfunctional pattern to one that operates to create strong families and abundant jobs. Where the information superhighway itself is concerned, or the National Information Infrastructure as we formally call it now, we're going to have legislation next year, and I'll be making I'll have more to say about that later in the month and next month. We are very serious about creating this information infrastructure on terms that will not create a distinction between haves and have-nots. You know, where there are bookstores that sell books to those who have the money, there are also libraries where people without money can check out books. That same basic approach ought to be applied to the electronic databases that are now becoming so important, and the information superhighway. And the next phase of our information infrastructure project is focusing on things like digital libraries and ways to ensure universal access. We believe that's an important principle. Yeah.
My name is Emil Michael. I'm a senior at Harvard College. And it seems to me that Republicans and Democrats alike agree in the idea of the empowerment networks and zones, and the idea of bringing the kernel of the free market into the inner cities to help solve the problems there. And it also seems that the administration, at least with the passed budget bill, by increasing taxes on corporations and personal incomes, would seem to work against that idea. And I want to know
What would work against it?
the increases in taxes on corporations would serve to limit their willingness to expand into the inner cities to give those inner city people jobs. And I want to know if you think that would have that effect, and if the new parts that you're adding onto this empowerment network idea would outweigh the increase in taxes on corporations and individuals.
There are a lot of myths about the economic plan that passed earlier this year. One of them has to do with corporate taxes. 96% of all small businesses in this country got a tax cut under President Clinton's plan. 96%. 98% of all individual taxpayers had no income tax increase. People talk about the gas tax. Well, of course, gasoline prices are now lower in real terms than they were when I graduated from Harvard, when I graduated from elementary school. They were higher in real terms than they are right now. So, what has happened? Well, may I seize the opportunity to just review the evidence briefly. We have seen a decline in the unemployment rate, a significant decline in the unemployment rate. In fact, in the first 10 months that we have been in office, we have seen the creation of 1.6 million jobs in the United States in the last 10 months. On an annualized basis, we are creating twice as many jobs every year as were created in the entire 4 years of our predecessors. Real interest rates are at historic lows in spite of the increasing economic strength in our economy. Housing starts are up for 3 months in a row. Building permits are up. Durable goods orders are up. Consumer spending is up. Consumer confidence is up. Inflation is still down. In the campaign, I used to get carried away in my stump speech, and I'd build up to a crescendo and say everything that should be up is down, everything that should be down is up. Well, now a lot of things that should be up are up, and a lot of things that should be down are down. A lot more people are going back to work. We're seeing the return of confidence in our ability as a nation to build a bright economic future. We're very pleased by that. We think that we're making progress. But at the same time that we give you that evidence, we understand fully that in Congresswoman Harman's district in Southern California, there are way too many people out of work. In parts of this state, in New York, in places all over this country, there is still a lot of suffering. We've got a lot to do, but we're making progress. And, I just think that the evidence is pretty strong on this point. We've been doing it steadily and slowly. A lot of times people are tempted to resort to football metaphors, and they say, where's the 95-yard touchdown pass? Well, we've been cranking out 3 yards in a cloud of dust over and over and over again. You put 3 of those in a row, you come up on a 4th and 1 situation. We've had several of those. You may have noticed I've had an opportunity to vote a few times, and it's changed my whole outlook on life. I don't know if you've noticed this pattern, but every time I vote, we win. It's really been encouraging. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Zishan Zaidi. I'm a sophomore at the college and a member of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute of Politics. And my question has to do with the structure of government with a bit of a personal twist, if you don't mind.
I'm sure I won't mind.
When you and President Clinton took office in January, I read in an article that you in particular had a very tough act to follow. Not Dan Quayle's, but your own, Senator Al Gore's. And the author was wondering whether the office of the vice presidency would allow you to perform the way you had in the Senate. And
I worried about that also. Wondered if it was really adequate.
Well, my question is, from a structural governing point of view, how has your experience as vice president been, and how has that shaped the way you view the role of the vice president, which is, it's an office that has historically been very important, but not all that well defined?
Golda Meir once said to someone who was responding to a generous premise, and she said, "Don't be so humble. You're not that great." I have really enjoyed the role that President Clinton and I have worked out for what I do in the administration. I defined the job very early as simply doing everything I possibly could to help him be the most successful president possible. We have a genuine partnership, a genuine friendship. What you see is what you get, and there's nothing made up about it. We are of the same generation. We have the same approaches to most issues. We genuinely enjoy the constant dialogue that we have about these problems. And he has been very generous in asking me to participate in his deliberations on most things that come before him. And I feel as if I've been able to make a contribution. Now, when you ask me to compare it to the role of a senator, they're very, very different. I feel as if a vice president with a close working relationship with the president can have a lot of impact on what happens. And I enjoyed being a senator. I enjoy this more. Yeah.
Bienvenido, Mr. Vice President Gore. It's definitely an honor to have you here today. And my question revolves with looking at restructurement and reinventing in a different way. And I think finally people are starting to realize that they're realizing to diversify ethnically the workforce makes for better business, better politics, and better service delivery. My specific question to you is what strategy you and the President may have towards diversifying ethnically the civil service system and the non-cabinet level appointees so that not just the cabinet, but all of the government workforce can look more like America.
It's certainly an important goal. We have committed ourselves to it. And our record, if I may say so, I think exceeds that of any previous administration by a long shot. I agree with the premises of your question, that our nation is made a lot stronger if we appreciate and reach out for diversity. You conceded that in our cabinet we've sort of shattered all records, and we're proud of that. We have also done better at the sub-cabinet level, though not by as big a margin, and we're proud of that too. In the Reinventing Government effort, we paid special attention to ensuring diversity within the civil service. And we're going to work at that on a regular basis. In the reduction of the 252,000 positions we called for, we want to make sure that that takes in a way that doesn't diminish diversity because so many of the more recent applicants are often vulnerable to layoffs. We're concentrating instead on the middle management positions, which will not have the same side effect where diversity is concerned. But we agree with you. It's a very important goal.
Thank you.
May I suggest that we go a few minutes longer? Is that okay with you all? Is that, no? If it's, no, there may be dissenters on that, but yes, we'll go for a few more. Yes?
My name is Lisa Popick. I'm an MPP2 here at the Kennedy School. I guess I'm a little concerned about a Department of Cleveland in Washington.
Yeah.
And I was just curious if the theoretical decentralization was going to lead to a physical decentralization, if we might have a stronger federal presence in cities helping on projects like our own Boston Harbor project or the Central Artery project.
Yeah, it's not going to be in Washington. It'll be in Cleveland, because each of the departments have representatives and offices in the communities that we are working with. And we want them to be empowered to make appropriate decisions on how to integrate their efforts with those of their colleagues in other departments, so that there is a seamless approach. We believe very strongly that when you decentralize authority, if you do it in the right way, you're going to get better information and better decisions. Now, of course, if you do it in the wrong way, you're going to create a catastrophe. We believe we know how to avoid that. You know, I believe that properly understood, the theory of decentralized decision-making fits with what computer specialists call distributed intelligence, fits with the principle that makes market economics superior to socialism, fits with the principle that makes representative democracy work well. If you recognize that any organization must see the men and women in that organization as the most valuable resource it has, and then pay attention to what they're thinking and what their ideas are, and then regularly gather those ideas and engage them in a mutual effort to try to solve the problems that you confront. That's the best way to do it. And where the federal government is trying to respond to problems in Cleveland or in Watts or where else, anywhere else in this country, we have to listen a lot better to the people who have the best information, not turn over the decision making and the responsibility the federal government has to discharge, but listen very carefully and devolve as much decision making as possible to the people who are closest to the problem and relate directly to them on the ground. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, my name is Abram Klein, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and my question has to do with inner city schools. In considering our inner city schools right now, you can't help but be left with the impression that the nation needs to be doing more to stop what seems like a total breakdown in education and crime and a range of things. And you mentioned Schools 2000 as one of your initiatives. I'm wondering what else can be done by our nation's leadership to begin changing what's a very serious problem?
Well, don't dismiss the Goals 2000 approach too quickly. We believe that it is the right approach, and it is really based on the same underlying philosophical shift that I described in my speech today as being common to our approach to the environment and to distressed communities. Specifically, Goals 2000 is an effort to identify all of the significant changes that need to be put into place for a school to turn around. You know, I mean, the same basic principle applies. You can't just single out one problem in isolation and sequentially and try to approach them one at a time in isolation from the others. You have to look at the way the system operates. Look at the factors that have influence over the way that system operates. Learn from experience. Goals 2000, which incidentally was crafted in significant measure by then Governor Clinton and his colleagues in the National Governors Association, and was a true national consensus on what these factors are. It embodies the best agreed to list of the kinds of changes that schools need to make if they want to have the best possible chance of becoming successful at what they do. And then follow it up with a program to actively help do that. And that's what I referred to, and that's what we're going to do. Yeah.
My name is Paul Steinberg. I'm a student of environmental policy here at the Kennedy School. My question addresses migrant farm workers and pesticide poisonings. You came into office on the theme of change, and it's been very encouraging to see lots of changes in the environmental and energy policy realm in particular. Hazel O'Leary was here the other day, and it was really good to hear after years of neglect that these issues are starting to move forward. One issue that, as far as I can tell, has just been sitting there and discussed a lot, but not acted on over decades since it was first central to the movement of Cesar Chavez in the 60s and 70s and so forth, is poisonings of American farm workers, migrant farm workers, poisonings of migrant farm workers who handle pesticides on a daily basis. In 1989, the EPA estimated that 30,000 to 300,000 are poisoned in the United States each year, just from the direct, not the cancerous, but just the direct effects. That seems an issue in need of change, an issue in need of somebody to pick it up and do something with it. Are you aware of any sorts of changes planned in the administration regarding federal policy towards pesticide use, particularly as it affects the people who handle it on a day-to-day basis?
Yes, I agree with that too. The Environmental Protection Agency has called for a new standard for pesticides, both because of the dangers posed to farm workers and also to those who consume residues, and they're in the business of implementing them. Secondly, the President will sign an executive order next year on environmental justice. It's in preparation now, and it is based on the widespread and growing recognition that here in our country, the victims of environmental abuse are far more likely to be minorities and the poor than any other category. And it stands to reason, if you look at the worst environmental problems around the world, they occur in the places where people have had relatively less political and economic power to defend themselves. The formerly communist countries were devastated because the people, when they saw their skies darkened and heard their children coughing and tasted the chemicals in their water, had no recourse politically or economically to speak out and bring about changes. And so they and the environment in which they live suffered. The same thing is true here in the United States. In a different way, but based on the same principle, you can find a disproportionate number of Superfund sites and other serious environmental hazards in communities where the people have had relatively less ability to defend themselves. And migrant farm workers fall into that category, and this new executive order will touch upon that also. Yes?
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
We'll make this the last question, and I apologize to those who have been waiting. Yes?
My name's Erin O'Connor. I'm a Canadian doing a Master's of Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. I'm taking a class where I'm studying your report because we're part of the transition team for a new Democratic administration, your administration actually. And I'm really concerned about the human aspect of this. You're talking about getting rid of 252,000 public servants. And I understand from talking to many of the mid-careers here that there are many middle and senior managers in the federal government who are terribly demoralized by this. They are reluctant to take part in reinventing government because they feel that they'll be reinventing themselves out of a job. How are you and the President going to reinvigorate the people who have to carry out your program?
Actually, the response within the federal workforce to this report has been extremely enthusiastic. You're right that there are some middle managers who are apprehensive about the impact of the report. And in some cases, they should be if their only focus is on the likelihood that the job they now perform will change. But look at it this way. In the private sector, the ratio of managers to employees is about 1 to 15. In high-performing companies that have the best track record, it's often as high as 1 to 75, but the average is about 1 in 15. In the federal government, it's 1 in 7. And in many federal departments, it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 4. And if you look at the category called management control, 1 of every 3 federal employees is in the business of management control. Well, in the old industrial era, when people were divided into 2 categories, those who did the thinking and those who had the muscles and did the physical work, and tasks were organized in order to maximize the benefits that could come from repetition of tiny segments of a collective task, and then it was all assembled. Then it made sense to have layer upon layer of managers in order to make certain that the blueprint was always just so, and that these people who actually did the work but obviously couldn't think according to that theory wouldn't go wrong. Well, after people realized that their most valuable resource was the unused brain power and creativity of the men and women who were actually doing the work, there was an internal distribution of those management functions down to the brains of the people who were also using their muscles in the work. And these organizations got rid of a lot of the middle-level management positions. Some of the people who were affected ended up doing other jobs, either on the line or in the front office or wherever. Some of them looked for other employment. And some of these organizations saw a stark choice between reorganizing according to a much more efficient way of doing things or going out of business. Read the story of Harley-Davidson. There are lots of similar stories all over this country. Government has suffered from the illusion that it didn't matter what it did or didn't do. It was always going to be there and always going to continue. Well, the people of this country are demanding change, rightfully, and the same transition that we've seen in these high-performing private sector organizations will have to take place in the federal government. It just has to happen. In some cases, it has taken place. Look at the Air Combat Command in Langley, Virginia. They're responsible for our fighter planes, interceptors, some of the strategic bombers as well. They now operate sort of the way Walmart does, organizationally. I mean, they rely on the people who actually do the work to make intelligent decisions. As a matter of fact, when Walmart went into the pharmacy business, they have a practice of seeking out the best performer in a particular line of work and then seeing how they do it. They went to the Air Combat Command because they have the best pharmacy business of any organization in the country, public or private, because they figured out this new way of organizing themselves. Well, if the Air Combat Command can do it, the rest of the federal government can do it. We really have only 2 choices where this is concerned. We can take the meat axe approach and respond to the continuing budget crisis by just cutting across the board and taking this old approach that just causes havoc in agencies, or we can do it intelligently and improve the quality of service at the same time we save resources. And we're confident that it can be done. And those who resist it, I would urge them not to do so, because it's going to happen. Thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here.